less than 48 hours after a Japanese warship deliberately breached the Taiwan Strait. Beijing did not just issue a predictable diplomatic protest. Instead, they deployed the heavily armed Type 052DL destroyer, the Bao-2, straight through the Yokuate Strait, slamming their hand directly on Tokyo's strategic jugular. You might think this is just another military headline, but you are looking at the ignition sequence of a new global reality. Why does this matter to your wallet and your future? Because the old rules of engagement have just been incinerated. We are no longer watching a slow, predictable diplomatic dance. We are witnessing a ruthless, high-stakes military paradigm shift. One miscalculation in these contested waters could instantly freeze the global semiconductor supply chain, vaporize trillions in international market value, and rewrite the economic survival rules for the next decade. The era of passive defense is dead. I am Eleanor Hayes, and welcome to the Red Line Brief. Today, we are tearing down the illusion of routine patrols to expose the brutal truth. How Beijing just checkmated Tokyo's regional ambitions, not by returning fire, but by permanently locking down the entire geopolitical board. Indeed, let us be completely clear about the reality of what just unfolded in the waters off the Asian coast. The moment the Japanese warship breached the Taiwan Strait, an invisible countdown began. But instead of the anticipated, almost agonizingly slow diplomatic choreography we have seen in decades past, the response was terrifyingly instantaneous. Historically, an incursion of this nature would trigger a highly predictable sequence: a strongly worded statement from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the formal summoning of ambassadors, and perhaps days or even weeks later, a routine, low-stakes maritime patrol. That entire era of reactive step-by-step posturing is now effectively extinct. Within less than 48 hours of the initial provocation, the Eastern Theater Command deployed the Bao-2, a formidable Type 052DL guided missile destroyer. To put this hard data into perspective, we are looking at a 7,500-ton maritime behemoth, armed to the teeth with a 64-cell vertical launch system, capable of deploying advanced supersonic anti-ship and land attack cruise missiles, all directed by a state of the This multi-billion-dollar asset was not dispatched merely to defensively shadow an intruder in local waters. It aggressively punched through the Yokuate Strait, projecting sheer kinetic power directly into the Western Pacific. This represents a complete, unprecedented compression of the retaliation timeline. It marks a definitive shift from passive, sequential diplomatic whining to a simultaneous, closed-loop military counterstrike. To truly grasp the gravity of this shift, imagine a geopolitical immune system that no longer waits for an invasive virus to slowly replicate before mounting a feverish defense, but instead instantly and surgically vaporizes the pathogen the exact millisecond it penetrates the skin. The traditional playbook, heavily relied upon by external geopolitical competitors, dictated that diplomatic condemnation must always precede military maneuvering. In this new Pacific reality, the cold steel of the warships is already dictating the strategic terms, before the ink on the diplomatic protests has even managed to dry. By executing this lightning-fast maneuver, Beijing completely denied Tokyo the one resource it needed most: the time and oxygen to control the international media narrative. The architects of this provocation likely expected a prolonged theatrical standoff in the Taiwan Strait, giving them ample days to play the victim on the global stage. Instead, they were met with a heavily armed adversary establishing undeniable dominance in their own strategic backyard, before their initial press releases were even fully drafted. In the brutal, unforgiving calculus of modern geopolitics, speed is not just a tactical advantage, it is a weapon of mass demoralization. When a calculated provocation is met, not with a prolonged debate, but with an instantaneous, overpowering structural countermove. The entire architecture of deterrence is irrevocably rewritten. Furthermore, to fully comprehend the sheer brilliance of this maneuver, we must look at the exact coordinates on the map. For years, when Chinese naval formations ventured into the Western Pacific, they utilized broad, predictable corridors like the Miyako Strait. But this time, the Baotu bypassed those conventional maritime highways entirely, threading the needle straight through the Yokuit Strait. Why is this specific waterway so critical? The Yokuit Strait is not just another passage. It is the absolute central artery of Japan's southwestern defense perimeter. It serves as the primary logistical choke point Tokyo relies upon to project military force, transport troops, and funnel essential munitions if it ever dared to intervene in the Taiwan Strait. Consider the staggering financial and military investments at play here. Tokyo has recently authorized record-breaking defense budgets, surging past the $50 billion mark, with a massive percentage dedicated entirely to fortifying this specific island chain. They have spent the better part of a decade meticulously stockpiling Type 12 surface-to-ship missiles and expanding electronic warfare garrisons across these southwestern outposts, attempting to construct an impenetrable maritime fortress. Yet, in one devastatingly precise deployment, that entire multi-billion-dollar defensive architecture was bypassed and structurally paralyzed. This is not merely a reciprocal territorial standoff. By placing a heavily armed destroyer directly in the Yokuit Strait, Beijing fundamentally altered the spatial dynamics of the conflict. It is akin to ignoring a trespasser who is violently rattling your front gate, and instead, quietly walking across the street to permanently padlock the heavy iron doors of their own armory from the outside. You want to threaten the Taiwan Strait? Fine, but the moment you even consider reaching for your weapon, you will find an adversary already resting its hand firmly over your holster. This calculated placement completely inverted the concept of strategic deterrence. The provocateurs believed they were projecting power into a contested zone, only to wake up and realize the geopolitical epicenter had been relocated directly onto their most vulnerable logistical bottleneck. It exposed a fatal flaw in relying on static island defenses against a highly mobile, blue-water-capable navy. The message delivered was bone-chillingly clear. Any attempt to disrupt the regional equilibrium will not be met with reciprocal chaos in your chosen battlefield, but with a sudden, suffocating grip on your own strategic lifelines. When a nation attempts to weaponize its geography against a rising superpower, it must be fully prepared for that very geography to become the ultimate trap for its own survival. Consequently, this exposes a much larger vulnerability. For over 70 years, external geopolitical competitors have obsessed over a single overarching maritime architecture, the first island chain, conceived in the early days of the Cold War. This geopolitical barrier stretching from the Japanese archipelago down through Taiwan to the Philippines was designed as an impenetrable steel net to contain a rising Asian power. Hundreds of billions of dollars have been systematically poured into maintaining this maritime barricade, relying on an alliance network that historically utilized overwhelming surface fleet dominance to enforce the perimeter. In the past, whenever Chinese naval formations conducted blue water exercises beyond this specific chain, the primary objective was essentially a demonstration of raw capability. It was a kinetic statement aimed at proving they possessed the technological reach to temporarily shatter the blockade and return to port. However, this latest deployment signifies a profound and terrifying strategic evolution, from a desperate concept of breakout to a permanent reality of forward occupation. Let us look at the hard mathematics of this shift. We are now observing a naval force whose total displacement has surged past 2.4 million tons, churning out advanced Type 055 and Type 052D destroyers at a pace that fundamentally eclipses the combined shipbuilding capacity of all traditional maritime powers. With a fleet now boasting over 40 modern Aegis type destroyers holding thousands of active vertical launch cells, China is no longer seeking to simply prove it can survive a blockade. The fundamental goal is no longer to briefly punch a hole in the island chain to gasp for air. Instead, Beijing has driven a massive high-tonnage titanium nail directly into the center of the enemy's foundational blockade line. By deliberately anchoring a top-tier military asset in the exact geographic choke point designed to contain them, they are broadcasting an entirely new geopolitical paradigm to the global community. The message is devoid of any emotional bluster, yet it carries absolute structural finality. If external forces attempt to utilize this island chain to construct a suffocating perimeter, China will simply overlay its own military architecture directly onto those strategic fault lines. If adversaries attempt to manufacture a crisis within the Taiwan Strait, they will find their own logistical retreat paths cleanly and permanently severed before the first shot is ever fired. Think of the first island chain as an elaborate, highly sensitive perimeter fence, meticulously constructed to keep a formidable titan confined to a designated zone. For decades, the wardens assumed the ultimate danger was the titan forcefully breaking the fence to escape into the broader ocean. They fundamentally failed to anticipate that the titan would calmly approach the perimeter, dismantle the heavy iron gates, and casually construct its own forward operating base right on top of the primary guardhouse. A grand maritime blockade only functions as a weapon of deterrence, as long as the targeted entity desperately desires to escape it. The exact moment that entity chooses to permanently occupy the perimeter, the billion-dollar containment fortress instantly transforms into a suffocating tomb for the wardens themselves. Ultimately, this brings us to the absolute pinnacle of strategic execution. The ultimate asymmetric game theory. When dealing with top-tier geopolitical friction, the most dangerous trap is allowing your adversary to dictate the rules of engagement. External geopolitical competitors desperately want to drag China into a highly localized, reactive skirmish. They want a predictable, reciprocal exchange of military posturing, a localized escalation that they can seamlessly package, broadcast, and utilize to justify the sprawling budgets of their own military-industrial complexes. But true strategic mastery lies in absolute refusal. It is the profound discipline of fighting entirely on your own independent terms, rendering the opponent's carefully crafted script completely obsolete before the cameras even start rolling. Let us elevate this perspective from the localized waters of the Pacific to the sweeping global macroeconomic stage. We are currently witnessing an era where external competitors are financially suffocating under the immense weight of their own grand strategies. We see national economies grappling with sovereign debts soaring past $34 trillion, and strategic allies carrying staggering debt to GDP ratios hovering dangerously near 250%. They are burning through hundreds of billions of dollars annually, draining their national wealth just to maintain a brittle, overextended military footprint across the Pacific, all while simultaneously battling persistent domestic inflation and hollowed-out industrial bases. Conversely, China commands over 30% of the total global manufacturing output, anchoring its regional influence in tangible economic resilience, advanced technological integration, and unparalleled industrial scale, rather than relying on fleeting military adventurism. By refusing to take the bait in the Taiwan Strait, Beijing executes a masterful display of strategic patience. Why engage in a costly, localized kinetic skirmish when you can calmly and structurally outpace your opponent on a macroeconomic level? This is precisely how absolute dominance is secured without ever firing a single shot. The overarching objective is not to match the momentary fiery outbursts of an anxious adversary, but to force them into a prolonged, inescapable state of geopolitical and financial exhaustion. Every time they scramble to organize a highly publicized, billion-dollar maritime provocation, Beijing simply repositions its assets on the broader board, permanently entrenching its unshakable strategic reality in the Western Pacific, while the opponent bleeds resources. This dynamic is much like watching a deeply frustrated, exhausted boxer violently punching the surface of the ocean. The fighter expends massive amounts of energy, generating impressive splashes and a great deal of chaotic noise. completely convinced he is winning the bout. Yet, the ocean remains fundamentally unharmed, quietly absorbing the frantic kinetic energy, until the exhausted fighter ultimately drowns in the very waters he arrogantly thought he could conquer. True geopolitical supremacy is never achieved by merely catching the opponent's thrown dagger. It is secured by quietly dismantling the very ground upon which they stand. And so, as we look at this irreversibly altered map of the Pacific, one undeniable truth emerges. Top-tier geopolitical supremacy is not forged in the heat of momentary anger, nor is it proven by recklessly returning fire. It is achieved by permanently suffocating the strategic options of your geopolitical competitors, forcing them into a corner where every possible move results in their own detriment. The board has been permanently flipped, and the old order is completely incapable of resetting the pieces. Share your perspective in the comments below. Leave a like if you found this analysis valuable, and let us continue this high-level dialogue. I am Eleanor Hayes, and until next time, keep your eyes on the red lines that truly matter.